Don't you remember what you did, Judge Boyd?
The morning sun sliced through the tall, dusty windows of the courthouse, casting long, sharp beams across the heavy oak bench where I have sat for more than 30 years. It was a Tuesday, a day where the machinery of the state usually grinds forward with a predictable, cold rhythm. I adjusted my black robe, feeling its familiar weight, a weight that, in this age of viral media, often feels more like a costume for a performance of power than a mantle of true justice. In my decades on the bench, I have learned that people do not come here just for a ruling. They come for an emotional release valve. They come because reality feels broken, and they need a voice of authority to say the things they are too desperate to believe still exist. I looked down at the stack of files for the morning session, the usual minor tragedies, the fees unpaid, and the broken promises. Each number on the page represents a life pushed to the brink by circumstances they can no longer control, hidden behind the rust of a failing system. I took a slow sip of water, the cold glass a sharp contrast to the humid air of the room. I signaled the clerk to call the first case, my voice calm, analytical, and devoid of the sarcasm that often infects those who have seen too much. "Let's see what the world has brought us today," I murmured, settling into the high-backed chair, a simulated throne for an authority that is performed, not just earned. The first few cases were forgettable. A young man loitering, an elderly woman who didn't understand a new permit. I offered them the performance of compassion they expected, working out payment plans that felt like a life raft in a storm. But then, the atmosphere shifted. The heavy doors at the back of the room groaned on their hinges, an invitation for a ghost to enter. She didn't walk. She marched. A woman in her late 60s, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her eyes locked onto mine with a predatory intensity. She didn't look at the podium or the files. She looked at me as if she were solving a puzzle that had haunted her for 20 years. My hand, poised to strike the gavel, hesitated. A vulnerable pimple of a memory began to throb under the surface of my consciousness. "Good morning," I said, leaning forward to bridge the gap of authority. "It says here, you are facing multiple counts of civil disobedience. Can you explain your actions?" The courtroom fell into a deathly silence, the kind of silence where the walls seemed to dissolve. She didn't answer the question. She leaned into the microphone, her voice a sharp blade that sliced through the simulated peace of my court. "Don't you remember what you did, Judge Boyd?" The gavel in my hand felt suddenly, impossibly heavy. The blood began to drain from my face, leaving behind a pale reflection of the authority I thought I held. The silence in the courtroom was no longer just a lack of sound. It was a physical weight, pressing against my chest until I could feel my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. That single question, "Don't you remember what you did?" had stripped away the simulated throne I sat upon. For a split second, I wasn't the Honorable Judge Boyd, a pillar of the Providence legal system. I was just a man caught in the crosshairs of a ghost. I looked at the woman again, searching for a name in the archives of my mind, but all I found was a cold, sharp dread. Her eyes were like flint, sparks of old anger dancing behind the cataracts of age. She didn't move. She didn't fidget. She stood there with the stillness of a statue, waiting for its moment of revenge. I tried to find my professional voice, the one I used to mask my own humanity, but it felt like trying to start an engine in a deep freeze. "Ma'am," I began, the word brittle feeling in my throat. "I have presided over thousands of cases in this city. If I have done something that has left such a mark on you, I believe you have the right to say it. But please, state your name for the record first." "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the rasp of a woman who had spent years shouting into a void. "But back then, I was just a mother with a son who looked up to you. I was the woman who believed the law was a shield, not a weapon used by ambitious men to climb the ladder of power." As she spoke, the name Vance, the pimple of memory I had felt earlier, finally burst, flooding my mind with images I had buried under 20 years of legal necessity. Suddenly, the humid courtroom air felt like the biting wind of a January morning in 2004. I remembered the construction site on 4th Street, a project backed by the city's most influential developers. I remembered the young man, barely 21, accused of a crime that looked more like a protest against the rust of the system than a felony. He was Eleanor's son, I remember the pressure from the mayor's office. They wanted an example made. They wanted the project to move forward without the stain of public dissent. I was a young judge then, eager to prove I was part of the team. I remember the way I looked at that boy from behind this very bench, not as a person, but as a file number that needed to be resolved for the sake of progress. I looked down at my hands, resting on the cool mahogany. They were younger then, unburdened by the cumulative guilt of 30 years on the bench. I had handed down a sentence that day that didn't just punish a crime, it dismantled a family. I had watched Eleanor Vance be dragged from this courtroom, screaming for mercy that I refused to give because my career depends on my toughness. I remember, I whispered, so softly the microphone barely caught it. The blood hadn't just drained from my face, it felt like it had frozen in my veins. I looked up at her, the authority I usually perform now, feeling like a leaden cloak. The courtroom held its breath. Eleanor Vance leaned closer, her shadow stretching across the floor to touch the base of my bench. "You didn't just sentence him, Judge Boyd," she said, her voice a chilling whisper that echoed through the gallery. "You erased him. And today, I've come to ask, was it worth the promotion?" The silence in the courtroom was no longer the quiet of respect. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb being unsealed. Every tick of the wall clock feels like a hammer striking my conscience, vibrating through the simulated throne I sat upon. Eleanor Vance's eyes didn't just look at me, they searched me, burning with a 20-year-old fire that no legal procedure could extinguish. "Mrs. Vance," I said, struggling to keep my voice from cracking, even as my heart hammered against my ribs beneath the weight of this black silk robe. 2004. It was a turbulent time for our city. I remember the case, but you must understand the pressure from the municipal offices, the civil unrest. "Pressure?" Eleanor interrupted, her voice a jagged blade of sarcasm. "Your pressure was about keeping that seat. My pressure was watching my only son have his future dismantled by a man who cared more about a promotion than the truth." Marcus was 21. He was a straight-A student. He stood on his grandmother's porch to protect her home from the Dixon Group's bulldozers. He wasn't armed. He wasn't violent. But you, Judge Boyd, you called his defiance domestic terrorism, just to satisfy the developers who funded your campaign. The memories flooded back, no longer a pimple, but a tidal wave of suppressed guilt. I saw Marcus Vance again, a young man with eyes full of disenchanted hope, standing where Eleanor stood now. I had chosen the path of least resistance. I had handed down a 10-year sentence with no possibility of parole, a draconian punishment for a civil act of protest. I had sacrificed him to prove I was tough on crime for the evening news. I acted on the evidence provided at the time, I whispered. My gaze dropped to the mahogany desk, unable to meet her piercing stare. "Evidence you helped polish," Eleanor's voice rose, a scream that tore through the simulated peace of the room. "You knew he was a kid protecting his legacy, but you needed a win. You needed the city to see you as the iron hand of justice. Do you know what happens when the cell door clicks shut on a boy like that?" Marcus lost his scholarship. He lost his faith in the world. And 2 years into your exemplary sentence, he lost his life in a prison yard scuffle over a piece of bread. A violent chill raced down my spine. I hadn't known Marcus was dead. In my archives, that case ended when the gavel hit the block. I had moved on, curating my image as the compassionate judge for viral clips, while Eleanor had spent 7,000 nights living in the wake of my ambition. My hand trembled as it touched the gavel. This tool of justice suddenly felt like a weapon of murder. I realized that the authority I performed every day was just a thin veneer over a rotting foundation of compromise. "He's gone, Judge Boyd. My son is dead because of your career moves," Eleanor said, leaning over the podium, her frail frame shaking with the weight of her grief. "And today, I didn't come here for these parking tickets. I came to ask you one thing. How do you intend to settle the debt for a life that was never yours to take?" The silence following Eleanor's question wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the room. I could feel the eyes of the bailiff, the court reporter, and the rows of spectators boring into me. For years, I had curated this courtroom to be a stage for common sense justice, a place where viral clips showed me as the hero of the underdog. But today, the script had been torn up, and I was exposed as the villain of a story I had tried to delete from my hard drive. Mrs. Vance. I finally managed to say, my voice sounded like it belonged to a ghost. I reached for the water glass, but my fingers were trembling so violently that the ice clinked against the rim, a telltale sign of a man whose simulated authority was collapsing. The Dixon Group. They were the primary developers for the 4th Street revitalization. At the time, the city's economic future was tied to that project. The legal filings claimed your son had sabotaged heavy machinery, causing millions in damages. The legal filings were lies. And you knew it, Eleanor snapped, her hand slapping the wooden podium. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The sabotage was Marcus standing in front of a bulldozer with a camera. He was documenting their safety violations. They didn't want a trial. They wanted him silenced. And you were the silencer. You were the one who fast-tracked the hearing. You were the one who denied his bail, citing him as a flight risk despite him being a lifelong resident with a 4.0 GPA. I looked over at the prosecutor, a young woman who hadn't even finished law school when this happened. She looked confused, her eyes darting between the files and the elderly woman. She was part of the new system, one that didn't know about the backroom handshakes and the gentlemen's agreements that defined my early years on the bench. In 2004, I wasn't a viral sensation. I was a man who wanted to be on the state Supreme Court, and the Dixon Group had the ears of the people who could put me there. Justice is supposed to be blind, Judge Boyd, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a terrifying, rhythmic strength. But your eyes were wide open. You saw the campaign contributions. You saw the invitations to the gala. You saw a boy's life as a small price to pay for the robe you're wearing right now. My Marcus died in a concrete box because you wanted to sit in a bigger chair. The blood had completely left my face. I felt a cold sweat breaking out under my heavy robe. The silk suddenly felt like a shroud. I looked at the gavel resting on the bench. I had used it to end Marcus's story, thinking it was just another case to be closed. But a life isn't a file. You can't just archive a mother's grief. I thought about the viral clips I had made, the ones where I helped a student with their tuition or forgave a parking ticket for a struggling veteran. Were those acts of genuine kindness? Or were they a 20-year penance for a sin I was too cowardly to admit? Was I a good man? Or was I just a man performing goodness to drown out the screams of Eleanor Vance? Eleanor, I whispered, dropping the missus and the ma'am. The professional wall had finally crumbled. I cannot give you back, Marcus. No ruling from this bench can undo the coldness of that cell. I don't want your pity, Judge, she said, her eyes turning into shards of ice. I want the truth. I want you to tell this court, and those cameras you love so much, exactly why you sent my son to die. The air in the courtroom didn't just feel heavy. It felt electrified, like the moments before a devastating storm breaks over a parched valley. Eleanor's demand for the truth wasn't just a question, it was an exorcism. She was pulling the ghosts out of my polished mahogany bench and forcing them into the light of the 21st century. I looked at the camera lens mounted on the back wall, the very eye that had made me a hero to millions, and for the first time, I wanted it to go dark. You want to know why? I whispered, my voice caught in the dry thicket of my throat. I looked down at the gavel. It sat there, a small block of wood that held the power to destroy lives, a tool I had wielded with the casual grace of a man who thought he was untouchable. In 2004, I didn't see Marcus. I saw a barrier to entry. The Dixon Group didn't just want to build condos. They wanted to build a legacy of cleansing the neighborhood. And I wanted to be the man who cleared the path. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The bailiff stepped forward, his hand instinctively resting on his belt, sensing the shift from a routine hearing to a public confession of systemic rot. I can see the headlines forming in the air, the people's judge, built on a foundation of blood money. I denied the bail because I was told Marcus was the face of the resistance, I continued, the words feeling like shards of glass as they left my mouth. If he was out on the street, the cameras would stay. If he was in a cell, the project could finish. I traded your son's freedom for a seat on this bench and the promise of a future I thought I deserved. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't scream. She simply leaned forward, her shadow engulfing the front of my desk. You killed him for a promotion, Frank. You didn't just make a mistake. You conduct a transaction. At that moment, the weight of the last 20 years, every forgiven ticket, Every kind word I had spoken to a camera felt like a mountain of lead. I reached out for the gavel, intending to call a recess, to run to my chambers and hide from the truth. But as my fingers closed around the handle, I realized I no longer had the right to hold it. My hand went limp. The gavel slipped from my grasp. It didn't strike the block. It tumbled over the edge of the bench and hit the floor with a hollow, pathetic thud that seemed to echo into infinity. Total silence. The gavel of Boyd, the symbol of my absolute authority, was laying in the dust at the feet of a woman I had destroyed. The pale reflection in the glass was gone. All that was left was a man in a black robe who finally realized that justice isn't found in a ruling, it's found in the wreckage of the lives we've stepped on to get here. The gavel lay on the floor like a dead thing, its hollow thud still vibrating through the soles of my shoes. In 30 years, I had never dropped it. It was the anchor of my authority. And now, it was just a piece of wood in the dirt. I looked at Eleanor, expecting to see triumph in her eyes, but I only saw a weary, soul-crushing exhaustion. She didn't want my ruin. She wanted the 20 years I had stolen from her. Suddenly, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open, they were thrown wide. The rhythmic, expensive click of leather heels on marble announced the arrival of the system before the man even spoke. Arthur Sterling, the city attorney and a longtime fixer for the municipal elite, marched toward the front, followed by two men in dark suits whose eyes never left the cameras. Your Honor, Sterling's voice boomed, cutting through the emotional fog like a chilled blade. He didn't look at Eleanor. He didn't even look at me as a person. He looked at the situation as a liability that needed to be liquidated. I am moving for an immediate recess and a gag order on these proceedings. The statements made here are unsworn, inflammatory, and a direct threat to the integrity of this court. Arthur, I said. My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. I didn't stand. I didn't reach for the gavel. I sat there in my robe, which now feels like a leaden weight pulling me into the earth. The woman is speaking. The record is open. The record is a disaster, Sterling hissed, leaning over the bar, his face inches from mine. He lowered his voice, but the microphone, the one I had used to build my viral empire, caught every venomous word. Do you have any idea what you've just done? You've just handed every ambulance chaser in the state a blueprint to sue this city into bankruptcy. The Dixon Group, the campaign ties. Frank, you're not just ending your career, you're burning the house down with us inside it. I looked at Eleanor. She stood her ground, even as the men in suits tried to crowd her space. She was a small woman, but at that moment, she looked like a mountain that Sterling's legal protocols couldn't hope to move. Is that what this is to you, Arthur? I asked. A sudden, sharp clarity piercing through my shame. A budget line, a PR crisis. A boy died. Marcus Vance died because I thought condos were more valuable than a human soul. Recess, now, Sterling shouted, turning to the bailiff. The judge is clearly under medical duress. Turn off those cameras. The bailiff hesitated, his eyes darting to me. He had been with me for 10 years. He had seen the performance of Judge Boyd every day. He was waiting for me to take control, to play the part, to hide behind the simulated justice we had perfected. But I looked at the floor, at the fallen gavel, and then back at Eleanor. No, I said, the word ringing, with more authority than any gavel strike ever had. The cameras stay on. Mrs. Vance hasn't finished her testimony, and I haven't finished my confession. Sterling's face went from professional concern to a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. He realized that the man he could control, the ambitious Judge Boyd, was dead. All that was left was Frank, and Frank had nothing left to lose. Eleanor, I said, ignoring the chaos, tell the court about the letter. The one Marcus wrote you before he died. The one the city suppressed. Arthur Sterling stood frozen in the center of the aisle, his mouth slightly agape, looking like a man watching his own execution in real time. He knew what was in that envelope. The city's legal department had spent 2 degrees ensuring that this specific piece of paper stayed buried in a misplaced box in the archives. I looked at Eleanor, and for the first time, her hands stopped trembling. The truth had finally given her back her strength. It's dated the 14th of June, 2006, Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the frantic whispers of the gallery. She pulled a yellowed, fragile piece of lined paper from a plastic sleeve. It was sent 3 days before Marcus was killed. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to the Honorable Frank Boyd. A cold, visceral shock hit me. I had never seen this letter. My staff, my handlers, the people who managed my rise to power, they had intercepted the final cry of a dying boy to protect the Judge Boyd brand. I reached out. My fingers brushed the paper. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable, the precise, careful script of a student who still believes in the power of words. I began to read, not to myself, but to the microphone, to the cameras, and to the city that had crowned me. Dear Judge Boyd, I read, my voice thick with a lump in my throat that I couldn't swallow. I'm writing this because I know I'm not coming home. The guards looked away when the Dixon Group's contractors visited the yard. But I want you to know I don't hate you for the sentence. I hate you because you knew the bulldozer safety reports were forged. I found the original files in my grandmother's attic, the ones showing the soil was toxic. That's why they wanted the land. That's why you sent me here. You didn't protect the city, Judge. You protected the poison. The courtroom was so silent I could hear the hum of the electronic clock. The Dixon Group wasn't just a developer. They were a hazard. And I had been their primary containment unit. I had put a boy in a cage so that a corporation could build luxury condos on top of a chemical waste site. The performance of justice I had practiced for 30 years wasn't just a simulation, it was a cover-up. Frank, stop reading, Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. You're committing professional suicide. I looked at Arthur, then at the rows of people who had watched my videos, who had liked my fair rulings, who had believed in the myth of the good judge. I felt a sudden, violent urge to laugh, a dark, jagged sound that stayed trapped in my chest. Arthur, I said, looking directly into the camera, professional suicide is the only honest thing I've done in this building since 2004. I turned back to Eleanor. I saw the mother who had lost everything. I saw the boy who had died protecting a neighborhood that I had helped destroy. I didn't reach for a law book. I didn't look at a statute. I looked at my own hands, hands that had signed the death warrant of a hero. The letter wasn't just a warning. Eleanor, I said. The blood finally returned to my face in a hot, shameful rush. It was a map, and I think it's time we followed it to the end. The letter from Marcus Vance lay on my desk like a burning coal. I looked at Eleanor, and for the first time in 30 years, I didn't see a defendant. I saw a teacher. She had just taught the most important lesson ever delivered in this building. That power without truth is just a well-dressed lie. Arthur Sterling was shouting into his phone in the back, calling for damage control, but his voice sounded like a mosquito buzzing against a hurricane. I stood up. I didn't need the gavel. I didn't need the bench. I stepped down to the floor, level with Eleanor, level with the people. Eleanor, I said, my voice finally finding its true resonance. Justice is a word we carve into the stone outside this building, but we rarely let it through the front doors. Today, the doors are open. I am dismissing every charge against you, but more than that, I am referring to the 2004 Vance case, the Dixon Group filings, and my own participation in this cover-up to the State Attorney General. I am not just stepping down as your judge. I am standing up as a witness. A roar of emotions swept through the gallery. Some were cheering, some were crying. I looked over at Leo, the young man from this morning. He was standing up, his eyes wide. He had come here to pay a speeding ticket, and he was leaving having seen a revolution. I walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Remember what she told you, Leo, I whispered. Don't just walk by. Help them. Pass it on. But also, don't ever let a man in a robe tell you that a building is more important than a human being. I turned back to Eleanor. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, old fountain pen, the one I had used to sign the warrant in 2004. I placed it in her hand. This belongs to a man who didn't deserve it. Use it to tell Marcus's story. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked towards the heavy oak doors. I didn't go back to my chambers. I didn't take my personal belongings. I left the black robe draped over the back of my chair, a hollow shell of a life I no longer recognized. As I stepped out of the courthouse and into the brisk Providence air, the sun was beginning to set, painting the city in shades of gold and deep, honest blue. My face was no longer pale. The warmth had returned, a steady, quiet heat of a man who finally has nothing left to hide. I am Frank Boyd. I used to be a judge, but as I walked toward the bus stop, blending into the crowd of neighbors and strangers, I realized I was finally something better. I was a man who had finally closed the circle. The engine of our community is still running, fueled not by the rulings we hand down, but by the kindness we show one another when the cameras aren't even watching. Pass it on.